Good morning, and thank you for joining us. This is our fifth, I believe, of 6 series on artificial intelligence, a conversation. And we're so excited to have Sanmay Das, who is at George Mason University, and will be speaking quite a bit on, as you see the title, Fairness and Justice at the Intersection of AI and Public Education. Our goal is to be really engaging. And so please use, as Rod said, the Q&A for questions. And Sanmay will address those questions as they come and as we can, fit them into his presentation. I'll give you a brief intro, and then Sanmay, I would love for you to even take your bio a little further because it's fabulous work that you've done in the realm of AI. Sanmay is a professor of computer science and co-director of the Center for Advancing Human-Machine Partnership at George Mason University. He has broad interest across artificial intelligence, machine learning, and computational social science. And then I would like Sanmay talk about your recent work. In your bio, it speaks about focusing on the use of AI in the allocation of scarce societal resources. And I thought that you would give it more justice than me if you were able to talk about that right before your presentation. So again, welcome and thank you everyone for joining us.
Thanks, Gina, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation. I will say that, I'm going to talk a lot about sort of what exactly scarce societal resources are, and introduce that as I go. So it'll show up in the very early parts of my presentation. So that will be part of it, and that's part of the focus that I'm hoping to bring over here. Just as a way of introduction, to give you a sense of sort of where I'm coming from, right? I started working in AI and machine learning sort of more than 2 decades ago. And then I became very interested at the intersection of AI and economics, and thinking about essentially the systems that are created by the combination of AI and human systems as well. In the last decade or so, there's been a surge of interest in the community in questions of as machine learning and AI get more sort of integrated with society, what are the impacts on different groups? What are the implications for fairness, for justice? How can we ensure that the use of AI is done in an accountable and transparent manner? And this has led to the creation of sort of a community, which sometimes is called the Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency community. Sometimes we think of it as sort of AI, ethics, and society. And these are communities that I've been part of for the last decade or so. And so what I want to do is I want to sort of bring a little bit of what we're thinking about in those communities into this conversation to give a sense of it. I will say, my work for the last 7-8 years has focused on a couple of different domains, including allocation of resources to help those who are experiencing homelessness. I've also been working on things like organ transplantation. Education is a fairly new interest for me. It's been cultivated in the last year or so through fantastic conversations with my colleagues, Ann Holton and Seth Hunter, especially at GMU. So I'm a little bit of sort of a novice in this area, but it's something that I'm starting to think a lot about. So what I'm going to try to do today is sort of, bring up my understanding of this, but please forgive a little bit of sort of naivete if it comes across in terms of this. And I'm as eager to learn from you, I'm sure, as perhaps hopefully you are, to hear what I've got to talk about. But let me jump in, and as Rod mentioned earlier, I'm very happy to take questions along the way. So I think we'll moderate. All right. So let me start with sort of what kind of got me into it, and what this meandering path that I described really isn't quite as random as it seems. One of my core interests has always been sort of in at the intersection of economics and computation, and an area that I've worked on for a while is the theory and applications of what's called matching in economics. And that's been used all over the place. So, kind of famously, one of the recent versions of it, part of for which Al Roth won a Nobel Prize in economics, was redesigning the program that matches graduating MDs to their first residencies, which had been around for a really long time, and it turned out to have deep connections with the math of matching, but then became complicated in the 80s as more and more people found themselves becoming couples while they were in med school. And then it was very hard to express their preferences for things like, oh, we'd rather be in the same city than have sort of the two best jobs that we could have in different places. And so Al Roth, whose background is in OR but is an economist, now spent a lot of time thinking about sort of how do you actually design systems that can take these sorts of preferences into account. And that's actually had ramifications in all kinds of domains. In the education domain, it's actually been used for the decisions about how to allocate students to different schools in very large sort of public school districts, including New York City, Boston, Seattle, various other places where there's some measure of parents being able to express preferences over which schools their kids should go to. And then there's all kinds of consequences for equity, for overall efficiency, and so on and so forth that we need to think about. More recently, these kinds of matching ideas actually got used even to decide to try to help place refugees in Europe, to try to figure out sort of where would they have the best chance of integrating well into the population and sort of having a successful kind of integration in that form. In a topic that's close to my heart, where AI has directly worked, is in organ transplantation. And in particular, one of the foci of research in that area has been on trying to think about living donor kidney transplantation, where we can actually, because we all have two kidneys, there's a way to think about sort of transplanting one kidney from one person to another. But if they happen not to be compatible, even though you may want to give your kidney to your partner, you may not be medically compatible. Are there ways of actually engineering chains of transplants that actually lead to more people being able to get kidneys, those kinds of things? So these are all areas where AI has had a tremendous amount of influence. But there's also been kind of a fear, right? And then there were a couple of books, again, we're talking, about a decade ago is like where a lot of this action started happening, that really raised a lot of public consciousness of some of the areas where AI was being used, and that could have sort of unforeseen and potentially harmful societal consequences. And to give you a few examples, to me, this is to some extent a success story because it never actually got deployed, but Amazon for a while was developing an AI recruiting tool to help them to try to think about sort of, who should they interview for positions or who should they employ. And then when they did an audit of this before they ever sort of put it into production, they discovered that actually it was biased against women because the training data that it was based on was kind of biased against women. So it was kind of learning the inbuilt biases in there. I'll talk a lot more at one point because I think it's very directly relevant to some of the issues that come up in the use of AI in education systems, about this problem of recidivism prediction and how a recidivism prediction tool that is used by judges to decide on decisions about parole or about bail could actually potentially be biased against Black people. And so there's also been work on, so these are kind of, what I consider some of the founding events of the field, particularly the ProPublica machine bias study, the gender shades study that actually looked at face recognition technology. And there's a great movie about this called Coded Bias. If you haven't seen it, I usually try to show it when I'm teaching my undergrad class. That actually looks at this question of like, why is face recognition technology much better on, let's say, white faces than Black faces, right? So this was another example that came up. There's been sort of calls to say that, if you're doing predictive policing, which is where you decide on allocations of police forces to different neighborhoods, you can end up in these really bad feedback loops where you're sending more and more police, they're discovering more and more crime because it happens, just that if you have more people deployed, you're going to find more of what's going on. But then that leads to a vicious cycle where you get more and more deployments in areas and other areas are getting neglected because the data that you're getting from your deployment process is feeding back into the decision making that you're doing. And while these are from all different domains, you'll see how many of these could potentially be quite relevant to thinking about how we think about allocating resources in a societally important domain like education. So I just want to clarify, Gina asked me to do this right at the beginning, but just to give you a sense of what is this precise setting that we're thinking about over here. So I'm thinking about the allocation of resources that are, first of all, scarce. So, everybody can't necessarily have them. They're also controlled or regulated by society. So what does that mean? That means that basically the standard market mechanisms that we've been thinking about are not appropriate for allocation in these kinds of situations. Economics bills itself as the science of the study of scarce resources, but there are many situations where we don't want markets necessarily, or at least completely unregulated markets, to exist for some of these. And the examples that I've talked about are exactly that, right? If we're thinking about public education in particular, that's something that we've decided that we want to be providing societally. Organ transplantation is something where we don't want people trading in organs in most countries in the world. Homelessness resources are another. They're they're a program that is supposed to be setting up the social safety net, and therefore we don't. That's automatically not something where you want people to be trading in those kinds of things. So this kind of problem has been studied under the term local justice in the political philosophy literature, and I have this sort of central hypothesis that has been driving my research for a little while, that analyzing AI systems for the allocation of scarce societal resources through the lens of local justice is the right thing to do, because it can help us in two ways, more than two ways, but these are sort of two big things. One is it can clarify the objectives of system design. And the second is, so it can tell us sort of what is it that we're actually trying to achieve. And then the other area is that I think that it can be really helpful in helping us identify precisely where in the pipeline there could be sort of real value being added from the introduction of AI and algorithmic techniques into the loop, right? So to give a brief overview of the principles of local justice, as Elster kind of spelled them out in his seminal work, there's sort of many allocation systems that that people have used over the years. And this includes systems that are based on all different kinds of things, right? It could be systems that are based on status, systems that are based on age, prioritizing women and children first to go into lifeboats is an example of a scarce resource that's being allocated. Any kind of queuing system is basically allocating based on waiting time, right? So anytime that you enter the line at Disney World, that's a just system to some extent. Now you can pay your way out of it, but you get in line just like everyone else, and when it's your turn, you get up there. Power and influence have obviously been used. Sort of, typically you don't want that in most kinds of systems, but that is a way in which allocation has historically been done. Lotteries are another sort of system, and there's various sort of public schools that have lotteries for specific programs or specific schools. And that's another way of allocating scarce resources that is, generally considered fair in a lot of situations. These are actually not the kinds of systems that I'm interested in thinking about in terms of the potential use of AI. The systems that I'm particularly interested in thinking about are the ones where we can take into account specific properties of individuals and the interaction between the individual and the resource that's being allocated. So for example, in the education domain, you might think about, okay, is this the kind of student for whom this particular kind of coaching might be helpful? Or, in the other domains that I've worked on, is this kidney a good match for this person in terms of tissue type, blood type, et cetera? In terms of refugee allocation, people often think about, okay, are there a lot of people from this person's native country in the place where we're thinking about placing them as a refugee? So in all of these cases, the success of the allocation is dependent on an interaction between the individual and the resource that is being allocated to that individual. Okay, so those are the kinds of systems that I'm interested in thinking about. So now I'm going to sort of simplify and go into this. This is much more complex than this, but nevertheless, it's a useful sort of formalization and window to which you can think about, right? Suppose I could say I can reduce, at least for the purpose of my task, individual welfare to a single dimension W that we can measure. If it helps, you may want to think about some kind of a risk score. The education context in which I'll talk about this a little bit is this idea of like, suppose you have a score that is measuring risk for, is this student likely to drop out? So that's sort of one example. The common ways in which different systems prioritize are the following. So first of all, you could prioritize those with the minimum pre-allocation welfare level, right? This means that start off by providing resources to those who are most at risk or most vulnerable. This is done in all kinds of domains, right? Homelessness, educational support based on dropout risk. So I'll talk a little bit about a study that uses Wisconsin data on that. Liver transplant is another area where we tend to allocate to the most vulnerable, those who are sickest first, right? So the idea is that in this case, you prioritize those who start off at kind of the lowest level of the welfare. The other option is to instead think about sort of, what's going to happen after allocation of the resource. So you could prioritize those who will have the maximum post-allocation welfare. Elster calls this the level criterion. This is somewhat more rare, but for example, you can often see a case being made that elite schools may be selecting those who are already extremely gifted and would have highest post-schooling quality, even if the school's marginal contribution to that may not be that high, right? So so over here, we're basically trying to target those who would end up with the highest welfare level at the end. And finally, there's what is sometimes called the increment criterion, which is the greatest increase in welfare level, right? Allocate to those who would have the most value added. The most sort of famous example of this is battlefield or medical triage, where you're actually saying, okay, the people who should get medical intervention are those for whom the probability of survival is most increased. And unfortunately, we were having a lot of these conversations, especially during the early parts of COVID, when we were thinking about ventilator allocation and who should receive ventilators if there aren't enough to go around. I'll just note that these are considered in terms of the individual. We're not in terms of their value to society or anything like that, which is actually a big thing. So this is one thing that I find very useful to point out, is that actually, thinking about it this way emerged from the bioethics revolution in the 1960s that started with one of the founding events over there was this question of like, who should have access to dialysis in sort of the early days. And there used to be committees that would make these decisions based on things like, oh, what do we know about this person? What's their marital status? How many kids do they have? Do they go to church regularly? Or do they own a local business that serves the community and so on? And one of the core things that the bioethics movement really kind of pushed was this idea that we don't want to be considering those things. We want to be thinking about this in terms of the individual, not in terms of sort of some idea of what they contribute to society. And the reason I'm sort of bringing that up is because there's a lot of parallels between the development of bioethics then in the 1960s and what we're thinking about in AI ethics these days. All right, so how can AI be useful? And I'm going to use this to then jump into talking about some specific ideas. But I just want to stop and see if there are any questions that would be useful to address at this point in time.
I have not seen any come up in the chat or the Q&A, but I encourage people to drop those questions in.
Okay, sounds great. All right, so let me carry on for now. And so I'm going to think about sort of, what are the possible places in the pipeline where AI can help? So the first one is really in thinking about, can I predict outcomes under different allocations? So in terms of the conversation that we've just been having, this is where AI can be used in measuring and predicting the welfare level W. And so the question becomes, can machine learning methods, which have become very, very good at prediction, better capture what current systems, which are typically bureaucratic, right? We often have like scoring systems that say, hey, I'm going to assign risk based on certain like features, like, does this person have these sort of risky features that we've determined. So instead, and I'll talk about this in the context of Wisconsin data, right? Can we measure usefully the probability of a student dropping out? Right, so we know a lot about that student. We have their educational history. Can we say something about sort of, what is the risk that this student is going to drop out? And there's just no question that we are much, much better at predicting that risk well today than we were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and that machine learning models are much, much better at this than sort of, the traditional kinds of models that used to be used. The other thing that we might want to do is we might actually want to think about the probability of a student dropping out conditional on some interventions. So suppose we were to give this student extra coaching, right? How much would that help in terms of preventing dropout? These are the kinds of questions that we might now be able to ask. So this second one is really a causal inference problem, right? Where there's a really important sort of future prediction that's going to be happening, which is just suppose we give this person this type of intervention, so type of intervention A versus type of intervention B, which one will perhaps more reduce their risk of dropping out? So there's a bunch of work that has been thinking about this in the area recently. So I just want to say in the refugee allocation case, there were a couple of papers that took advantage of the fact that prior allocation of refugees was often random to get at this question of, causality versus correlation, and to say, okay, there's actually sort of a causal effect over here, that because people are being placed in certain places, they are able to have better outcomes. We looked at this in the domain of homelessness by estimating counterfactual probabilities, that is, what ifs that said, hey, if we had given this household a different type of homelessness support, would it have reduced their probability of returning to homelessness using sort of a relatively modern machine learning technique, in this case, an ensemble method called BART. So the questions that we have to think about in this are we learning models that are good, first of all, for both for prediction and for the actual task that we care about? And are these measures fair? Are they equitable? Are we perhaps introducing differences if we're more accurate at predicting outcomes for a certain race than another race? Or, for example, there's been a lot of talk recently about things that the FDA has to deal with, like pulse oximeters being much better at measuring oxygenation levels in through white skin than black skin, right? So these are questions that we have to be really careful about. There's another sort of major role that I think could be very important in the educational context, which is defining and quantifying desirable outcomes, right? So what is it that we are trying to achieve? So again, this has been an area of tremendous work. I haven't seen any of this yet in the education space, but I think it might be interesting to think about. And part of this is also hoping to seed some conversations, and if anybody's interested in talking or thinking about any of these questions, please send me an email later, even if we can't talk today. So what are social objectives? So the reason why I've put up these three examples are that these are very different ways of trying to understand what we're trying to achieve in one of these social systems. So there's this very famous moral machines experiment that basically looked at this famous trolley problem in the history of philosophy, which says, okay, we have a trolley and you can take an action that would change the outcome. It's out of control. Would you rather, run into a concrete, so this has been updated for self-driving cars, and the idea over here is, would you prefer to keep going and run over 3 pedestrians, or would you prefer to swerve and hit a concrete barrier, which could hurt the people in the car, right? So these are kinds of questions that you have to think about. And what they did was they did this giant experiment with hundreds of thousands of people providing sort of, what they thought of as their preferences across a range of these kinds of experiments. And then they tried to aggregate that and understand, differences in what kinds of outcomes people would like to see. The things that I'm personally more interested in and that I think might be more relevant are areas where one actually gets stakeholders to express their preferences. So there was a really cool experiment out of Carnegie Mellon called We Build AI that looked at this question of, if you're trying to prioritize where should the next food donation go, which food bank should it go to? There's a whole bunch of different things that come up, such as, what was the last time all the different food banks received donations? What are their needs? who is able to transport from one place to the other and when would they be able to transport it. And they actually solicited preferences of stakeholders in this community that looked at sort of, food banks and other places, and tried to think about sort of, okay, can we build a model of the preferences of stakeholders so that next time one of these questions comes up, we don't have to go and ask the stakeholders, but we can use the model that was built from their data in order to make the decision about where the next food donation should be routed to. And similar things come up in kidney transplantation, like, who should, be given the opportunity to get the next organ in these kinds of situations. So the other sort of big area has been in trying to understand the effects of optimizing different welfare criteria. So there's work on what's called the price of fairness, which is that if I have a fairer algorithm, what am I sacrificing in terms of efficiency? The things that we need to worry about here is, could learning preferences from stakeholders and humans perhaps perpetuate injustices that exist in these systems? And then the other question that, at some level always should be in the back of any computer scientist's mind is just like, every time we're doing something like this, right, we're translating between an actual social objective and a mathematical formalization of that objective. In some situations, that's an important thing to do, and we need to do it, but it's also important to keep track of, like, what might we lose in those situations. So, so I see there's a question that I will just take, which is, would the average education administrator be able to develop these questions, or will we be dependent upon vendors? And this is a great set of questions over here, right? And I think that, first of all, I think that it's impossible to develop sort of just systems in this area without the active participation of community stakeholders. And therefore, right, I think that the involvement of stakeholders in sort of different models, right? I mean, so we often, so in my homelessness work, I have a very close colleague in public health and social work, and we often use participatory model building methods with stakeholders to try to figure out, how do we go between the things that you care about and the kinds of things that can be answered by the kinds of techniques that we're looking at. There is a real fear when we go to sort of, commercial vendors that, we're getting kind of it's often a question of like, what's convenient, what can be deployed, and then we need to think about the profit motive. But many of the vendors are also doing really good work in terms of trying to come up with great ways of collecting the data, cleaning the data, making sure that it's valid to go. But I think the short answer over there is that we really need a participatory process where the questions are derived sort of through a partnership between the people who are thinking about the technical aspects and the people who have on the ground expertise over here. I'm happy to talk more about that later. I'm going to maybe skip through a couple of these because I think they're a little bit less relevant, right? We can think about how do we optimize, although I'll just throw it out there, right? One thing that we do think about is optimization under fairness constraints. So how do we achieve the most efficient outcome while still respecting, for example, that the disparity in resources provided across schools or across groups is not higher than a certain amount. So these kinds of questions are something that we've developed quite a bit of expertise in thinking about. Another thing that comes up is this question of like, when we deploy these systems, could we be inducing behavior change in the participants? And this might be a longer term concern, but I think it's actually important, which is to think about, okay, if we put out a system that says, okay, we're going to give resources to these kinds of people, could people try to perhaps game the system to try to get those resources? And would that then reduce the efficiency of the system, or perhaps even make it so that we won't be able to achieve what we were trying to achieve with the system in the first place, because the system was built on data where the generating process was different. And so we need to be careful about these kinds of things. So I want to talk about a couple of examples, and I want to start with a paper that's not my work, but it's by a bunch of people who do really interesting work on AI for different societal kinds of applications. And this is early warning systems in Wisconsin public schools. So the system that they're analyzing is what's called the dropout early warning system, which is basically a machine learning model that is trying to predict dropout from about 40 different features that they collect on students who are in the school system. And so what this paper actually looks at is there's a couple of very interesting findings over here. First is the model is accurate in ranking, right? So we have metrics that we often use to think about, how good is a model, and perhaps the gold standard of these metrics is what we call the area under the ROC curve, which in this case is 0.8, right? What does that mean? That basically means if you give me a random sort of high-risk student and a random low-risk student, there's an 80% chance that I will correctly identify the high-risk student as being higher risk than the low-risk student. The stratification is kind of good in the sense that they're able to find that 97% of the students that they classify as low risk graduate on time, and only 70% of those who they categorize as high risk do. So you would think that, this basically means that, that we want to use this kind of system to target resources to those who are high risk, because they're clearly at sort of, much higher risk than those who are low risk, right? So we could think about doing that. One important point that I'll talk a little bit more about on the next slide is that they also analyze this for whether there are disparities in predictive accuracies across races or, in fact, across historically disadvantaged groups. They found that this, in fact, may be actually slightly more accurate on historically disadvantaged groups, but at the same time, it may relatively deprioritize them for resources. So there's a little bit of a fear over there of what would happen in that case. But the thing that I found really interesting about this paper, which is where I think the difficult lessons in the title comes from, is that they compare. Usually when people develop these machine learning models, they're just like, okay, now I tested it and it looks like it's good. And they usually just test based on accuracy. But even if they test otherwise, they don't think about reasonable baselines. And they actually compare in their paper with a baseline that says, suppose we instead targeted resources simply based on schools and, sent more resources to the schools where more disadvantaged students may be. They basically said that, there would be no difference between implementing a model like that and implementing a more personalized model that was using these kinds of risk scores, right? So that's sort of the kind of gut check that I think is really important when we think about using these sorts of methods. Now, this doesn't mean that there aren't things that we can do, right? We could perhaps improve the risk scoring methodology. We could try to understand, where, what is the risk scoring methodology telling us about what's going on in the schools at which the high risk students are, and so on and so forth. But it is saying that, we need to be careful when we're thinking about deploying these kinds of techniques for individualized prediction. One other point that I'll make, which is close to my heart, right, is that this is basically looking at a single sort of intervention, right? Who should we target for more resources? I think that there's actually great opportunity in thinking about targeting different types of interventions to different people, and thinking about sort of what kinds of interventions might be best for different categories of people. So that's something that that is, I think, worth thinking about here. So I just want to talk about a related story over here, which is just things that we need to be careful about, and that this is what I said was, one of the founding stories of the FACT community, the Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency community, which was this recidivism prediction example. So this actually burst out in public when ProPublica wrote a story on the COMPAS algorithm that is used for these criminal sentencing risk assessments, right? And the key things to know about this study are, first of all, that they were trying to predict the risk of recidivism, which is especially of violent recidivism. But they trained a machine learning model on features that did not include race. And then this was actually used a lot by judges to decide whether to release defendants who were awaiting trial or not. And ProPublica basically published what they said was their kind of smoking gun over here for bias in this risk prediction instrument, which was, if you look at essentially false positives, right? These are people who were labeled high risk even though they didn't reoffend. And you broke that out by race, you would find that actually the false positive rate was much, much higher for the African-American population than the white population. What would this mean in practice? This would basically mean that African-Americans got held while awaiting trial much more often than the white population, right? Which clearly seems unfair. Now, the story is unfortunately a little bit more complicated than that, because the defense that the company Northpoint used was that if you look at each risk category, the proportion who reoffend is approximately equal, regardless of race, right? So in that sense, it's fair. It's basically saying that the Black population proportion that reoffends conditional on being high risk is the same as the white population proportion. And that's sort of one of these weird mathematical facts that initially was like, how is this even possible? But then it turns out it's actually quite easy to see if you just sort of, break it out. But actually, this inspired a bunch more work. And that was kind of a very famous result that has had all kinds of ramifications in the community, which was an impossibility result about fairness. So, and that basically says, suppose you have two groups, A and B, and I think this has important implications in education in other areas as well. If you have two groups that have different base rates, right, which could be reoffending in the recidivism case, it could be dropout in what we've been talking about. You can actually prove mathematically that unless you have a perfect classifier, which we're very, very far from, right? One that was able to, perfectly identify who's going to drop out, in which case we wouldn't even need to be thinking about these issues. We cannot simultaneously achieve both these notions of fairness. We cannot simultaneously achieve the same false positive rate on the two groups and calibration of risk scores. And that sets up a clash between what we often think of as being fair to the individual. That is, for an individual, you don't want their race to have any effect on the outcome, and being equitable to different groups. Because at the same time, while you might be being individually fair, just because there's been a higher rate of recidivism in the Black community in the past should not necessarily mean that we keep more of them incarcerated when we know that that incarceration itself is going to have bad effects on them in the future. So we are simultaneously trying to be fair to individuals and ending up being unfair to groups. And I think that the same kinds of things, if we're thinking about using early warning systems or these kinds of risk scoring methodologies in education, are things that we need to be sort of really careful about and audit for anytime that we're using these kinds of methods. I want to talk a little bit about sort of some recent work that I've been doing with students on essentially this question of sort of testing and classroom performance for identification of gifted and talented students. So very quickly, sort of the context for this is that we know that, minority and historically disadvantaged students are underrepresented in gifted and talented programs, which kind of, are ubiquitous. We have like more than 30 states that require these. And at the same time, sort of the programs lead to significant achievement gains. There's evidence, in fact, that the most significant achievement gains may be concentrated among Black and Hispanic students who are in these programs. And yet at the same time, they're underrepresented. So there's been sort of, some fairly clear evidence that a big part of the reason for the underrepresentation has been that teacher and parent referrals tend to focus more on those communities that are not historically disadvantaged. And one policy implication of this has been a push towards universal screening in this area, right? And thinking about, okay, if we screen everyone through these tests, then at least we're not getting bias at the first level of who's getting to take these tests at all. So we've been working on sort of a very simple model that tries to look at a different sort of thing, which is this question of like, can we do good identification without taking, because you want to be sort of, potentially blind to whether someone is initially coming from a particular community or a disadvantaged group. And so we've looked at this question of testing versus classroom achievement, and this question of how does the achievement gap potentially affect representation in these programs. So I'm not going to sort of go into the mathematical details, but the key point over here is that suppose we have this goal of identifying, we'll just call high achievers for the moment, but like, those students who are who should be in the gifted and talented program. But we're basing this on a test, and students who come from advantaged backgrounds who are not high achievers may get some real benefit from this test. So this in this test taking. So this is kind of dependent on the idea that the measurement instrument itself is, it could be somewhat biased, but like the idea is that hopefully it'll be less biased than some other measures, which there's some evidence for, at least in the early childhood kind of testing compared with later testing, where resources that are thrown at testing problem tend to have more of an impact. And so in this case, right, what we do is we model this as saying, okay, if you're a high achiever, you're going to have sort of the same chance of passing the test. But if you're a low achiever, you get a significant benefit in trying to pass the test from coming from an advantaged background. So now what would happen just if you were on a test-only model in this kind of a situation? This is just some basic intuition, but if we look at it, you don't need to worry too much about this graph, but what it's showing is that on the x-axis over here, we have the capacity of the gifted and talented program. And on the y-axis, we're showing two different things. One is the lines that are sloping down are showing sort of how many truly gifted and talented students do we miss out on. And that shows, obviously, as you would expect, that as the capacity increases, we're missing out on fewer and fewer of those students. And so that's good. We're doing a better job at the identification task. And yet, at the same time, this blue line that's curving up is showing that because of the advantage that's conferred on advantaged students in terms of testing, the disparity in the proportion of low achievers, right, those who are not truly gifted and talented, who get into the program, increases between the advantaged and disadvantaged group as the capacity goes up. So this is it's kind of an important trade-off over here to think about sort of, how are we treating different groups in terms of equity as we're trying to go about doing something that we think is important, which is the identification of these students to provide them appropriate resources. So one thing that I want to just quickly point out is that we actually then looked at this question of saying, suppose advantage manifests differently in classroom achievement and testing results, right? So it's possible that students who are from more advantaged backgrounds get more of a benefit, at least at this early childhood stage, in terms of how they're seen in the classroom, what they're able to do, and in teacher referrals and so on, than they are in testing. And the key insight that we've been able to sort of come up with through our methods is that if we can estimate the level to which this advantage manifests differently, we could actually take advantage of this to improve admission strategies over what we could do with either simply classroom observation or simply test results, to do a better job of identifying, the students who actually need access to these programs without introducing as much of the inequity as we're seeing in sort of the other model. So I want to leave you with a quick description of some of the work that we've been doing in a different domain, right, which is homelessness allocation, because I think that this might actually carry over and translate, and there might be some ideas over here to think about in terms of what could be done. And I'll just sort of, conclude in the next sort of 2 or 3 minutes, just so that maybe there's some parallels that one can think about. So in homelessness, right, the model that we're working within and what we have a bunch of data for is a situation where we have households that contact the system for services, and we get a bunch of socio-demographic data on these households and other data. For example, is there any kind of substance abuse problem? Are there mental health problems? Are there other sorts of health problems? How big is the family? What is their income? All of this kind of stuff. And we also have access to information on which intervention they received. And these are 4 different interventions. Actually, there's 5, but we're not considering one for technical reasons. And they're kind of, in order of sort of more intensive to less intensive. So transitional housing is the most intensive. Rapid rehousing provides quick turnaround to a stable housing situation. Emergency shelters are what we often think of as kind of the baseline response. And then homelessness prevention is a model where you try to provide other resources to help people get out of a potential homelessness situation. And the goal is to return them to stable housing. And the measure of that is, did they again need homelessness services within the next 2 years? So I think there's potentially quite a number of parallels to thinking about different kinds of interventions that are provided to students, and did they successfully graduate, for example. So in this kind of a domain, right, what we have is we have data that says, okay, these are the types of households or families that we've seen. These are the resources that they got allocated. And based on that, what machine learning is pretty good at is figuring out, okay, can I come up with a good estimate for this probability, the probability that you will still be stably housed 2 years later, conditional on the resource that you received? A really tricky question here is, can I do a good job of identifying counterfactuals where we may not have a lot of data? So if this type of household was, which is, let's say, a single mother with one child, was almost always allocated transitional housing, we don't know very well, or we can't be super confident about how that kind of household would do if they were instead given rapid rehousing. So this is one of those things that actually machine learning is getting better at. And so in this case, what we did was we estimated these counterfactual probabilities using machine learning. So this idea is similar to this early warning system, except I think the one thing that we're doing that is kind of nice over here that may have some potential is we're able to kind of look at different possible interventions and think about how would this household do under these different types of interventions. And we then try to use that to re-optimize our resource allocation. And we show that, you know, if we were to have implemented this, we believe that we would have been able to reduce re-entry rates into the homeless system by about 5%. So I had a few extra slides, but I don't actually want to talk about it. The one idea that I will leave you with from this is simply that whether we are being fair to different groups really depends on how we measure fairness, as I've talked about before. But this is true even in the group context. And the one insight from our homelessness work is if you're measuring how well someone is doing by improvement over the baseline, that is sort of, you know, how well would they have done with minimal or baseline resources, compared with regret, which is how well could they have done if they were given the best resources for them possible. We again run into some of these impossibility theorems that say, as long as groups look different in their distributions, we can't simultaneously be fair along both of these notions, right? We might be, so we need to think carefully about sort of, are we trying to target improvements over the baseline? Or are we thinking about, you know, how close can we come to the best that all groups can possibly do under different kinds of interventions? And the question of fairness and how we want to think about it is, I think, essentially a social and political question at the end of the day. So some takeaways, right? The last decade has seen an AI revolution. I've talked today about sort of non-generative AI, right? We're thinking about sort of measurement and prediction rather than LLMs, which of course have a lot of different uses that are possible, but we're just beginning to explore what's happening over there. The idea is that we're becoming really good at prediction, and that could be super useful in a bunch of different domains, including improved measurement, thinking about how do we target interventions, and perhaps in terms of figuring out what are our social goals and how should we optimize them. I'm a big believer that the goals themselves have to be decided through a social and political process. I think there's a really important couple of roles for computing. So I really like this quote from a paper by Abebe et al. That says, computing has a really important goal as a formalizer, a role as a formalizer, which is we can shape how social problems are explicitly defined. And that can change how those problems and possible responses to them are understood. And that can be broad. And this actually relates to the question that we had earlier, right? Which is just when we get together and we have a conversation with people who are on the ground in the domain, right? We learn how to try to model the question, but often that leads them to think differently about what's going on in the domain as well. And my own personal evolving research goal is really to inform policy through the work that we're doing, potentially inform individual decision-making, but I think that's further down the line, right? If you think about sort of deploying AI or using vendors in these situations, I think that has to be a collaborative process to think about, you know, how to get the best outcomes for everyone involved in those situations. So I just want to say thanks. A lot of the work that I've talked about that was ours is done in combination with a bunch of students and faculty co-authors. I've learned a lot in the last few months from education from Ann Holton and Seth Hunter at GMU. Very grateful for the insights that they're always providing. Funding for our work is from the Hewlett Foundation, NSF, Amazon, Mason, and the Washington University in St. Louis Institute for Public Health. But all opinions are my own. I don't speak for any of the above. Thank you so much for your time. Yeah, if there are any other questions and stuff, I would be very happy to discuss them.
Sanmay, this is Gina. You hear me okay?
Yep.
There was some a question about, I believe you addressed it really well in your presentation about any concerns with bias, and thank you for that, because I know that that becomes the forefront thought on the minds of many educators. But there was also another question that maybe you could address, and maybe even with some tips, for educators. And you spoke often about how important it is to involve stakeholders and to really, really understand that need to be connected and to build the capacity for people to understand the use of AI, et cetera. But are there ever have you seen like unintended consequences or risk associated with the use of AI? And should that be the case, what maybe top 3 tips, in addition to involving stakeholders, would you have for educators where this is such new territory, not necessarily new? We've used AI in lots of ways and sometimes didn't even know it. But now that there are rich resources for educators, what would you advise?
Wow. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a great question, right? I'm going to answer that a little bit more broadly even than just a talk, right? I think that the 2 things that I would, so here are things that I would worry about, right? And that I do often worry about. One of them is straight off the bat, like, are we introducing unintended bias into any of these systems? And I think there's a long way one can go with auditing and trying to think about sort of, okay, let me look at sort of, groups and how they would be affected by these systems. But it is somewhat limited in the sense of, exactly this question of like, if I implement a policy, there's going to be changes that happen as a result of the fact that I'm implementing that policy. And because of that, I think that the only real solution over here actually is similar to the solutions that people think about in the cybersecurity community, which is just, we need to constantly be in a loop of measurement and improvement and measurement and improvement. It's not that like, we can take this system, we can deploy it, we can test it, we can deploy it, and it's done if it's working at the beginning. I think that like, ongoing measurement of the impacts that it's having and how people are responding to it and whether it's still achieving the goals is really important. This comes up a lot in cybersecurity, where we think of it as the arms race between those who are trying to break the system actively and those who are trying to protect the system. But it also comes up in situations like finance, for example, where for years there's been a lot of algorithmic trading, and the idea is that because those algorithms are deployed, they change the market, and then new algorithms need to be deployed. I think there's a little less fast-moving and a little less adversarial, so hopefully it won't be as bad. But that's one thing I would be very careful about. I mean, the other thing, which was slightly outside of what I talked about today, but in thinking about just the incredible deployment and scale of things like LLMs and AI right now, is that one is that I think that people need to be educated about them and know, what they're good at and what they're not good at, right? I mean, for example, one thing that I've been constantly surprised that people don't get is that like an LLM or a chatbot should never, ever, ever be trusted for something that is factual. And I always find this funny because I used to do work on Wikipedia, and there was always this thing of like, it's almost a meme, right? That like, oh, you can't use Wikipedia as a source. And like, teachers, like my daughter's in 5th grade, and she always comes back and tells me, oh, my teacher said like never use Wikipedia. Wikipedia has far more reliable information in general than an LLM will give you, right? Because at least there's a set of humans over there who are moderating and constantly trying to figure that out. I'm not necessarily suggesting it's always a reliable source, but it's pretty good. And that's partly because of the humans that are involved in that. In fact, it's almost entirely because of the humans that are involved in that ecosystem. And I think that with LLMs, there's a great worry that because they have a really authoritative tone in the language that they use, that people will imagine that that's actually a proxy for confidence in the answer. And that this will lead to all kinds of issues. So I think that education, right, in the sense of the educators being educated about the capabilities of these models is important. One thing I'm worried about long term that I'm actually leading a study on right now is this question of what will the long-term effects be? Could there be a loss of capability of humans and AI to generate new knowledge if we become over reliant on LLMs. I think that's something to kind of worry about on that front as well. So those are sort of my two big ones there.
Yes, thank you so much. Rod, I believe you're back and we're reaching closure.
Yes, I'm back.
I'd like to thank everyone who was able to join us today. Sanmay, this was fascinating. And I have had, I noticed in the chat a few people who wanted to connect with you. I gave them my email so I could get them the information that they needed, but this was so helpful. Again, new territory in some ways, some uncharted, but I attended an AI session at Longwood University last week and was totally taken aback about all the AI resources I've used and didn't even know it. So pretty fascinating world, and educators for sure have to always think about student privacy and equity and opportunities that don't that are actually for every child. And so that's so important. You did a really good job with that. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. You know, we used to have this joke when I was growing up in AI, when it wasn't a big thing, that it was like, what is AI? Oh, it's just the thing that's being done that has just not been deployed yet. And now it's kind of the opposite, right? Now you listen to the radio and everybody's doing AI for everything, even if it's not AI. So it's hard to know. But yes, I mean, AI has been there and everyone here has been using it for a while, whether you know it or not.
Yes, well, thank you again. And everyone who was able to attend, we really appreciate you joining us. We do have another session scheduled in March. And by joining, you're automatically signed up. So hopefully you will appear as a participant in our next session. So again, thank you and be well and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you all.